January 15, 1919. The temperature in Boston, Massachusetts rises in the afternoon sun, and in the neighborhood of North End, a disaster is waiting to happen. At around 12:30 to 12:40 p.m., a massive tank full of 12,000 metric tons of molasses bursts at the Purity Distilling Company, letting loose a gigantic wave of the sticky syrup that covers the surrounding area. Welcome to episode 2 of Fox Files. I'm Stoneware Fox, and this is the story of the Great Molasses Flood. Now, before I begin, I want to thank you guys so much for, again, bringing my Killer Bean Schizo Post video up to more than 75k views, which honestly, in the grander scale of YouTube, isn't a lot, but it's a lot for me. I honestly have no clue why it continues to get so many views, but y'all are awesome and actually brought me up to the point where I became monetized off of that video alone for some reason, so thanks for that. In other news, I set up a Twitter account so you guys can follow me over there if you want to keep up with some updates. I also set up a Patreon where you can go and support me as well. I don't have a lot of stuff just yet to make a paid membership worth it, so please don't feel like you have to give me anything. And also sorry that this video was kind of delayed. It's been in development hell for about a month now, but hey, it's out and I hope you enjoy. But that's it for channel stuff, so let's get right into the case. So as you heard in the intro, this quite absurd event took place in Boston, Massachusetts, in what is now a redeveloped part of the North End neighborhood. On this particular day, a giant container full of molasses burst and spilled all over the town, causing all sorts of damage, injuring 150 people and claiming the lives of 21. Now, if you don't know what molasses are, all you really need to know is that it's a byproduct of refining sugar with about the same consistency and thickness of honey, but a lot less sweet. And the reason why there was so much of it in one place is, of course, alcohol. Like anything containing sugar, you can ferment molasses and make a kind of alcohol called ethanol, which you can then use for things including fuel and gunpowder and poisoning yourself. And it just so happens that the tank full of molasses that burst was owned by the Purity Distilling Company, which was a subsidiary of the larger United States Industrial Alcohol Company. And all of this basically means that these particular molasses were going to be fermented, which, as you'll see in a bit, also might have contributed to the disaster. What happened on that day is that the structural integrity of the giant molasses container absolutely failed, and because molasses is about 40% more dense than water, the sheer mass of it caused everything in the tank to condense into a giant wave. A wave that was up to 25 feet, that's 8 meters high, and traveling close to 35 miles an hour, or 56 kilometers per hour. For reference, the fastest human running speed recorded by Usain Bolt is a bit over 23 miles an hour, or just under 28 kilometers per hour. So yeah, nobody was outrunning this thing, but that's really just its speed. The amount of force that the wave carried was enough to severely damage a portion of elevated railway that was nearby, and you're looking at crushed steel beams, by the way. It also damaged some surrounding buildings, including a firehouse and a police station, and according to this damage diagram, the Purity Distilling offices were completely flattened and torn off their foundations. Besides this, a residential area was also damaged, claiming the lives of 2 residents living in that residential area, with 19 others, giving a grand total of 21 fatalities. And believe me, I'll cover what eventually happened in regards to those fatalities real soon. Right after the accident, 116 cadets from the nearby USS Nantucket rushed to help everyone on the scene, immediately struggling as they were up to their knees in molasses. When even more help came, efforts were so slowed to the point where some people had to dive into the molasses to get trapped people out of there. And apparently, the rescue process took 4 days before they just stopped looking for people. I mean, some of the deceased victims were not even found until months after the disaster because the molasses pushed them into the water in the initial flood, and other victims could hardly be recognized because they were literally covered in syrup. And in one account, they found a man, his wagon, and his horse all completely swallowed up by the molasses. And so was pretty much the rest of the neighborhood, for that matter. I mean, cleanup was an absolute nightmare, with most of the syrup being washed away with either water from the Charles River pumped from a fireboat or partially absorbed using sand. But the entire cleanup really took several weeks. If you ever tried to clean anything sugary off the floor, for example, you know how hard that is, right? Now, imagine an entire neighborhood now covered in syrup. Like, this stuff was on the street, inside the buildings, on streetcars, houses, pretty much everything. And the worst part is that it started spreading to the rest of Boston because there were people helping clean up and taking the syrup with them on their clothes or on their shoes and getting it absolutely everywhere. The water in the harbor was brown in molasses for months. That's how bad it was. And it led to people claiming that they could smell the sweetness in the air, like the smell of molasses. People were saying that they could smell that years after the incident happened. But looking back to the causes of the incident, we have a couple of things to look at here. The first, of course, being the metal of the tank itself, which apparently was very poorly maintained and built. In fact, the person responsible for overseeing the tank's construction was later found out to be outright unqualified to do so, completely neglecting to properly test the tank for leaks and other red flags. Later investigation found that the tank had been leaking molasses long before the incident happened and was even painted brown to hide the fact that it was leaking molasses. Maintenance checks were clearly not done since there was found to be a large crack in the base of the tank, and not to mention that the thickness of the tank was apparently half as thick as it should have been. But another factor you can't exactly blame on one person or party is temperature. Now, if you remember, this happened in January, which is smack in the middle of winter for Boston, right? However, if you've ever heated up maple syrup or honey, you know that as those thick liquids get warmer, they flow more easily than when they're cold. So if it was winter, then you'd assume that the molasses should have been thick and less flowy. Well, that would have been the case if not for 2 days earlier when the tank was topped off with warm molasses from a fresh shipment, heating up the rest of the molasses and making the syrup thinner. What we can also theorize is that this heat somewhat shocked the metal tank, since the Boston winter would have kept it cold. Adding warm molasses then would have given you more stress on the metal, which, however slight, would have contributed to the disaster. And speaking of disasters, I'm going to let Dr. Fox out of the attic that I've been keeping him in for a couple days so that he can explain fermentation or whatever and why this might have instigated the tank bursting. What's up everyone, Dr. Fox here again, and today's lesson is on fermentation. Fermentation is a process that some yeast and bacteria use to break down their food for energy when they can't exactly get oxygen. Now, normal cellular respiration in most cells takes in sugar and oxygen, does some funny stuff inside the cells, and makes chemical energy, and also spits out carbon dioxide and water. But fermentation is actually a bit different. The kind of fermentation we're concerned with here for the molasses occurs with no oxygen and is a lot less energy efficient and results in ethanol. There's two kinds of fermentation out there, but for this, we're only going to worry about alcohol fermentation. And to get you a bit familiar with fermentation in case you haven't learned about it yet, fermentation makes a lot of the food that you and I eat possible. For example, a lot of bread and alcohol are fermented using yeast, and we have also pickled vegetables and yogurt, which are fermented using special kinds of bacteria. But the process of fermentation is greatly affected by temperature and, as I said, oxygen, which are two very important things to consider when trying to keep something alive in a confined space with nothing to do and nobody to talk to for 4 days. Calm down, I gave you food. No, you gave me a sack of potatoes and a lighter. Anyway, in the case of molasses, fermentation would have been pretty easy considering the heat of the mixture and the relatively low amount of oxygen in the tank. Now, in that molasses tank, there was practically an unlimited amount of food for any stray yeast to begin fermenting. In the tank, you would have had a ton of molasses, which here is represented by this glucose, which then is converted to something we call pyruvate. This pyruvate then goes through more complex fermentation processes inside the cells and ultimately gives you 3 products. The first thing you get is a very small amount of chemical energy, which we call ATP, but we don't see any of it because it's cellular. The second thing we get is the entire reason why we have molasses here in the first place, that being ethanol. And then the third thing you get is carbon dioxide. And the carbon dioxide is what we're pretty worried about, because if you have a sealed off tank with something continually producing carbon dioxide inside it, eventually you're going to get a pretty high increase of pressurized gases inside that tank. You put those pressurized gases inside a very poorly built and very badly maintained tank full of a cursed amount of syrup, and you're in for a bad time. Please don't put me in the attic again. You're not allergic to bees, are you? What? So as you heard, fermentation was pretty much just the cherry on top for the disaster. I highly doubt that any one of these causes would have been completely responsible for what happened, so I'm going to say that all three of them did. I mean, this is the definition of a freak accident. Like, it had to have been several things working together that went wrong for it to end up the way that it did. But no matter why or how it happened, you'd think that people who died would at least get justice for it, right? And in some ways you could say it did, but I don't think so. After the flood happened, a massive class action lawsuit was filed against the U.S. Industrial Alcohol Company, the owners of the distilling firm that owned the tank. I mean, the accident caused massive property damage and 21 deaths, let alone the 150 injuries. So somebody had to get in trouble for it, and rightfully so. In a process that took way too long, in fact 6 years after the initial accident, the company had to pay out $628,000 in damages, which as of 2024 is about $11.2 million, an amount that is ridiculously low considering it destroyed homes and other important buildings. But the real crime is honestly how much the families of the deceased were given. For each victim, the families were reportedly given anywhere between $6,000 and $7,000 according to certain sources, which today is $125,000 for the high end. Not nearly enough for a very good reason, that being that some of these 21 deaths were children. One of these children was Maria D'Stasio. According to a small biography on Wikitree, Maria was right in front of the tank when this all happened. She was on her way home from school with her brother and was just trying to get a bit of the leaky molasses from the tank as a treat, as the neighborhood kids would usually do, but she was instantly killed when the tank broke. The other child's name is Pasquale Antosca. He, according to his Wikitree bio, was also walking home from school and was apparently Maria's friend. When the molasses burst, he was hit by a railroad car that had been also carried away by the flood, and to make matters worse, his dad saw him get carried away by this, with his body not being found until days later. So you can pretty much understand why the compensation wasn't enough. For many people, no amount will ever be enough to make up for losing a loved one. I don't know about you, but not even millions would compensate for something like that. And while there were several factors at play in the incident, you can't deny that complete negligence by the company was a major cause. Had the tank been built correctly or even received regular maintenance, possibly none of this would have happened, right? And because of that, I want to honor everybody who lost their lives to this accident by reading out their names. And may everyone in this list rest in peace. The victims of the Great Molasses Flood are as follows: Patrick Breen, William Brogan, Bridget Clougherty, Stephen Clougherty, John Callahan, Maria D'Stasio, William Duffy, Peter Francis, Flaminio Gallerani, Pasquale Antosca, James J. Keneally, Eric Laird, George Leahy, James Lennon, Ralph Martin, James McMullen, Caesar Nicolo, Thomas Noonan, Peter Shaughnessy, John M. Sieberlich, and Michael Sinnott. And I would really hate to leave it on such a sad and depressing note, so I feel like I should mention what became of the whole area that this all happened in. Today, the site of the accident is Langone Park, with the former location of the tank sitting inside the Dom Campochiaro Little League field, with every building that the flood destroyed now gone. Anything past Commercial Street, which the flood reached, is probably still there from before the flood happened, with only 542 Commercial Street eventually being renovated sometime in the 80s. Somewhere in the park's courts, though, a memorial plaque commemorates the Great Molasses Flood, a reminder of industrial negligence and the damage that it can do. Which is why I thought that it was good to recognize the victims, because the companies at fault most definitely aren't going to. I mean, I know this is 100 years ago and these companies aren't around anymore, but even then, the story of these people deserves to be talked about. And another thing worth talking about is you watching my video on it, which I always appreciate. I hope you enjoyed episode 2 of Fox Files and that you're liking the channel dynamic. Dr. Fox might not appear in every episode. depending on where I have him locked up that day. But if you enjoy his lessons, or whatever they are, go ahead and comment, like, and sub if you want. I'll let him know about that and maybe feed him a little extra as a treat.
I hate you.
With that, thanks again for watching. I know it's been more than a month since my last video, but part of that month was an absolute pain at my job, and I didn't like how this video was turning out in that meantime, so I delayed it until I was happy with the video overall. But I'm past the burnout now, so stay tuned for more. Thank you all for your support, and we will see you next time.